Hello everybody, and welcome to my Outlaws of Thunder Junction draft guide. In this video, I will be providing you with all of the information you need to find success in your Outlaws of Thunder Junction drafts. I will be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons, archetype overviews for each color pair, combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos to assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Outlaws, Crime, Spree, Saddle, and Plot. First up is Outlaws. It is basically a creature type, so Outlaws are assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, and warlocks, and then there are cards such as Mind Raider that care about Outlaws, whether you control them, whether they enter play, and things like that. Pretty simple. Next is Crime, which is a mechanic that cares about whether you are targeting opponents, anything they control, and or cards in their graveyards. So that will count as committing a crime, and then you will trigger your cards that care about committing a crime, such as Hard Bristle Bandit. Next up is Spree, which is a modal mechanic where you pay extra mana for extra effects. And you can pick and choose whichever one of the effects that you want. So in the case of Unfortunate Accident, you can pay a black mana plus 2 and a black to destroy target creature. You can play black mana plus 1 mana to create a 1/1 mercenary creature token, or you can do all three if you pay the mana for all of the effects. So it's pretty straightforward, but very powerful. Next is Saddle, which is a mechanic that lets you tap your creatures at sorcery speed to saddle your creature, and then the creature will gain extra upsides. So you can tap any number of creatures that you want to do the saddling as long as they have total power of the saddle number or more, and then the creature will become saddled until end of turn. Next is Plot, which is a big mechanic in this set. Basically, it lets you pay the plot mana instead of the creature's normal mana, and then it goes face up into exile, and you can cast it without paying its mana cost at sorcery speed on a later turn. So in the case of Djinn of Fool's Fall, you can either play it as a 5 mana 4/3 flyer, or you can pay 3 and a blue and put it into Plot, which means on a future turn, you can then cast it without paying any mana at sorcery speed. So that's just a nice little mechanic that really rewards you for planning out your turns in advance to maximize your cards. Moving on to the top commons, and first up is White. At number 1 is Holy Cow, which is just a really nice body combined with a really solid effect. So a 2/2 flyer for 3 would normally be a little bit understated for the modern era of limited, but the fact that it has flash means it plays really well with a lot of the synergy cards that we'll see later on in this draft guide, specifically in like the blue-white archetype. And also gaining 2 life and scrying 1 means that you're going to be able to find action in the late game. You're going to be able to find lands if you need it, and it's going to really help you in racing situations. So all of that combines to be a really nice card and one you'll be happy to take early. Next is Outlaw Medic, which is a pretty underwhelming stat line at a 2 mana 1/3. It's not terrible, but the fact that it has lifelink means that it's really going to be a roadblock for aggressive decks, and the fact that it draws you a card when it dies is excellent. So this is the sort of card that can get you a 2-for-1 sometimes, and is always going to be kind of annoying for your opponents to deal with. And at number 3 is Mystical Tether, just really nice interaction that can even be cast at instant speed if you pay a little bit of extra mana, which means in the late game it has some extra utility and value. So a nice removal spell rounding out White's top commons. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Phantom Interference. This is a really powerful spree spell because one of the downsides of this sort of conditional counter spell that we're looking at here is that in the late game, your opponent is going to be able to pay 2 mana. So this card would be a dead card. But in the late game, you get a 2/2 flyer at instant speed, which is exactly what you want. And if you are able to cast it with both sprees for 5 mana, counter your opponent's spell, and get a 2/2, you are going to be way ahead. And this card is just absolutely excellent as a result. Good early, good late, and has some really good 2-for-1 potential. Next up is Geyser Drake. 3 mana for a 2/3 flyer is already really solid stats, and the fact that it makes you able to cast spells for cheaper on your opponent's turn means that it plays really well with instants and anything that has flash. So really a nice addition to a lot of decks in this format. And then at number 3 is Take the Fall, which might look a little bit finicky as just a 1 mana, not a huge impact on the game. However, the reason this card gets put into the top commons here is because it is a 1 mana and very effective way to trigger your cards that care about committing a crime. And so if you are able to use this to trigger some of your crime payoffs, Take the Fall will replace itself by drawing you a card. Sometimes it will help you win a combat. And overall, it's just a really nice synergy piece that just plays really well with a lot of other cards in the set. There's also cards that care about casting multiple cards in a turn, and Take the Fall is great for that as well. Next up is black, and at number 1 is Consuming Ashes. 4 mana, instant speed, exile target creature, no questions asked. But if you do have to take a hit on the mana department and exile something smaller, you also get to Surveil too, which can be really nice upside, especially in the late game when you're really trying to dig for action. So Consuming Ashes, really nice removal spell and gets the number 1 slot. At number 2 is Vault Plunderer. 3 mana for a 3/1 is not a great stat line in this format because there are plenty of 1/1s running around, but the fact that you get a card out of this when it comes into play means that in a lot of situations it's going to be exactly what you're looking for, and as a result is going to be a really nice card to have access to. And then at number 3 is Mourner's Surprise, which is another really nice 2-for-1 built into a card. You get a 1/1 and you also get to get something back from your graveyard, which is just really nice upside. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Explosive Derailment, another spree card. You're generally going to be using this as a 3 mana deal 4 to target creature at instant speed, but if you do manage to pick off an artifact, or importantly be able to do both for 5 mana, kill an artifact and deal 4 to something, that's going to be really excellent, and Explosive Derailment is the number 1 red common as a result. At number 2 is Prickly Pear. You get 2 bodies for 1 card, it's only 3 mana, and you're going to be able to trigger your cards that care about Outlaws, which is just really, really nice. And then at number 3 is Irascible Wolverine, which is one of those cards that you can cast it normally in the late game when you're going to be able to flip something and just cast it instantly. But in the early turns, you're oftentimes going to want to use the plot ability on this card and then play it for free the following turn, so that whatever you flip over, you're going to be able to play that spell, hopefully, as long as it is within your mana arrangements. It's important to note that this can also let you play lands when you exile them, so that's just a nice little piece of upside as well, and often going to lead to a 2-for-1, which makes Irascible Wolverine come in at number 3. Next up is green, and at number 1 is Patient Naturalist. This is a really nice 2-for-1 built into a creature. As you can see, a lot of the top commons do involve getting some sort of card advantage, but a 2/3 for 3 mana is not a terrible stat line, and it actually comes with a land a lot of the time, and even if you miss a land, you will get a treasure token. Also, milling yourself can be beneficial for certain strategies, so that's worth noting as well. At number 2 is Bristleback Sentry, which is a really big stat line. It really is going to help you get to the later stages of the game, and if you manage to give it an extra point of power, maybe with one of those mercenary tokens that are running around, it can attack because it does just say a creature with power 4 or greater, which does include itself, which is quite nice upside. And then at number 3 is Throw from the Saddle. This card fits perfectly into this format because it will be able to target one of your things, deal damage to target creature you don't control, which means you're going to be able to commit a crime when you use Throw from the Saddle. There are plenty of mound creatures that you'll want to be using with this card, but even if you don't do that, you're going to be able to buff your creature, kill your opponent's creature, commit a crime, and then attack them. So really nice for just 2 mana. Moving on to some color rankings, and I first want to say that all of the colors are playable, and it is better to draft the open color than it is to force your way into a color that is maybe a little bit better. All of the colors are pretty close together, but if you have a close pick, then black comes in at number 1 with great removal spells and a really deep suite of creatures this time around. Red comes in at number 2 with another very deep suite of creatures, good removal spells, good interaction, a nice aggressive game plan. Blue comes in at number 3 with good synergy, ability to work at instant speed and fit into a lot of synergy decks well. White comes in at number 4 with just a little bit lower power level on its cards, but still a lot of nice effects there. And then green comes in at number 5 just because it lacks a little bit of card advantage that some of the other colors get, but still a really nice color. So these are just some color rankings for if you have a close pick, and be sure to draft all the colors because they are all playable if they are open. Next up is some archetypes, starting off with red-white. It is an aggressive deck that really builds on the mercenary mechanic to enable attacks so that you can pressure your opponents. Eartha Joe is a really nice tool in this deck because it makes all of your mercenary tokens trigger twice essentially. Form a Posse in the late game can make a bunch of mercenaries, which makes things really difficult for your opponents. And Prosperity Tycoon not only makes a mercenary token, so it gives you nice stats for the 4 mana that you put into it, but also can let you sacrifice those mercenaries to give it indestructible, which means it's a really formidable attacker that your opponent can basically never trade with profitably. So put some cards that make mercenaries into your deck and just have a nice, aggressive, cohesive game plan built around that. Next is blue-black, and this is a deck that cares about committing crimes. Intimidation Campaign is fantastic in this sort of archetype because if you have ways to commit crimes and you fill your deck with spells that are going to target your opponent's things, then you're going to be able to use Intimidation Campaign over and over to slowly grind your opponent out of the game. Marauding Sphinx is another nice tool in this deck. It's just a really nice top-end threat that helps you dig towards more action because when you commit a crime, you'll surveil too, which will help you find more spells that will target your opponent, which will let you surveil more. It's a really nice cycle there. And then Lazav, Familiar Stranger, is a really nice 3-drop in this deck because it has a really nice defensive stat line, and then it grows over time so that it becomes a threat that can kill your opponent while also slowing down your opponent in the early game with its blocking ability. Next up is green-white. This is the deck that cares about mounts and creatures that are going to saddle up those mounts. So Congregation Grift is a really nice card in this deck because a 3-mana 1/4 flyer with lifelink is already decent, and the fact that if you saddle it, it's going to get at least +1/+1 because it counts itself for mounts, but oftentimes it's going to get even more stats if you do build your deck around this sort of mechanic, means that it's going to be a really nice payoff for your mount deck. Miriam Herd Whisperer is another really nice card in this sort of strategy because if you're able to permanently buff your creatures with +1/+1 counters, then it means that you're going to be in really good shape to take over the game and snowball any advantage you're able to achieve. Also, the fact that your mounts are going to have hexproof means that you can crew them without worrying about your opponent killing the creature before they can attack, which is one of the downsides of mounts, is if you crew or saddle up the creature, then your opponent can kill it before it attacks, and then all of a sudden you've tapped one of your creatures for nothing. Miriam is also a 3-powered creature for just 2 mana, so it attacks well and also can saddle up pretty much any of the creatures that you care about saddling up. And then Frontier Seeker is a good card in any white deck, but especially good when you have mounts to find, because it just ups the chances of you making sure you hit something and also hitting something relevant, because then if you top deck your Frontier Seeker in the late game, you're going to be able to find a spell maybe instead of just a plains. Next is Blue-Red, which is a deck that cares about casting multiple spells in a turn. Crown Violent Cacophony is perfect in this deck because a lot of the time, by the time you get to turn 4, you're going to be able to have plotted something, which means you can play whichever creature, you can play Crom, and then you can play whichever creature you had plotted or whichever spell you had plotted, and then you get to cast it for no mana because you already invested the mana on an earlier turn. Then you get to put a counter on Crom, draw a card, and you just have a growing flyer that's going to get you a slew of card advantage. Really nice card for this deck. Slick Sequence is also excellent. It's a 2-for-1. If you've cast another spell this turn, you just deal 2 damage to any target. Usually you're going to kill one of your opponent's creatures and draw a card if you're building your deck to try and maximize these double spell payoffs. And then Brimstone Roundup is a really nice way to continually affect the board while you're casting a bunch of spells that maybe do impact the board themselves, but maybe they're just card draw spells or things like that. And Brimstone Roundup means that you're going to be able to make a slew of extra 1/1 tokens when you are casting a bunch of spells. It's also really worth noting that with Brimstone Roundup, a lot of the times you're going to want to plot it, because then on a follow-up turn, you can cast the Brimstone Roundup for no mana, and then whatever other spell you cast will be your second spell so that you can trigger it. It's also worth noting that if you have a lot of instant speed spells, you can sometimes double cycle in this sort of deck, where your Crom just says when you cast your second spell each turn, so that includes your turn and your opponent's turn. So on your turn, maybe you cast a couple of spells, and then if you have a couple of cheap instants, you can maybe cast 2 spells on your opponent's turn. It's not going to happen all that often, but it's definitely worth being aware of. Next up is Green-Black. This is a deck that cares about the graveyard, and Honest Rutstein is one of the best sorts of cards that you could put into this deck. Not only does it get you card advantage when you return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, attached to a 3/2 body, which is honestly just a rock solid stat line anyway for 3 mana, you also get to cast your creature spells for cheaper. So for example, if you mill something expensive, then you can bring it back with Honest Rutstein and then get a mana advantage. Or in the mid game, you can bring something back and then potentially double spell the following turn. So just really pile on your advantage and get some card advantage in the process. So Honest Rutstein is fantastic. Badlands Revival is also really nice because not only do you get to bring something directly into play, you also get to bring back any permanent from your graveyard to your hand, which means you can bring back a land if you've milled one, you can bring back an enchantment if it died, or things like that, in addition to just being able to bring back a second creature. So another really nice payoff. And then Rise of the Varmints is a really, really strong card if you can fill your graveyard, because in the late game, if you're able to make like 4 or 5 2/1 creatures, that's a huge advantage. A lot of the time, you are going to be able to plot this on a turn and then just use it in the late game, but keep in mind that your opponent will be aware of the fact that you've plotted it, and so will maybe not make trades with your creatures or things like that. And so Rise of the Varmints is a really nice payoff if you can enable it in your graveyard deck. Next is a blue-white deck, which is one of the decks that I was mentioning when I was talking about the importance of being able to cast things at instant speed. This is a deck that pays you off if you haven't cast a spell from your hand on your end step. So Gem, Lightfoot, Sky Explorer, really nice card. 4 mana, 3/3 flying, vigilance, already rock solid stats. But if you haven't cast a spell from your hand at the end of your turn, you get to draw a card. So it gets to keep fueling your deck, giving you stuff to plot with, giving you more instant speed cards to draw, which is really nice. Wrangler of the Damned, similarly, at the beginning of your end step, if you haven't cast a spell, you get to create a 2/2 flyer, which is really nice upside. So you can cast this on your opponent's end step, pass through your turn, make a 2/2, and then your opponent really has to deal with the Wrangler, or they're just going to get buried by flyers. And then Emergent Haunting is a really nice card in this deck as well. You cast it early in the game as a 2-drop, and then you always have the option of spending your mana to Surveil if you don't have something to plot with or an instant speed card to cast, which means that your opponent can really never know if you're just passing to trigger your payoffs or if you're passing to just use Emergent Haunting, which just ups the value of all of your instant speed cards. So Emergent Haunting is really nice in this strategy. Next up is Green-Red, which is a deck that cares about having creatures with 4 power or greater. So Jolene, Plundering Pugilist is really nice in this deck. It has 4 power itself, and when you attack with a creature with 4 power, you create a treasure, which can ramp you into more 4-powered things, and if in the late game you don't need to ramp anymore, you can sacrifice those treasures to start pinging out opposing creatures, or you can even ping your opponent to death with them if you have enough. Cactus Folk Sure Shot is also really nice as a 4-mana 4/4 with reach to protect you from flyers, ward to protect it from removal, and then you can also give your creatures with power 4 or greater trample and haste, which means that when you're playing your big creatures, you're going to be able to immediately make a huge impact and swing in and really pressure your opponents. And then Beast Bond Outcaster is amazing in this deck as a card that you can plot on turn 2. And then maybe on turn 3, you play a Jolene, and all of a sudden you have a 4-powered creature, cast your Beast Bond Outcaster, and now you get to draw a card. So it's a really nice top deck in the mid to late game when you already have a 4-powered creature in play, but it's also just fantastic if you plot it on turn 2 and then are able to eventually curve into a 4-powered creature to get that card draw and a nice 2-for-1 attached to a 3/3 body. Next up is White-Black. This is a deck that cares about tokens and sacrifice and things of that nature. Baron Bertram Greywater is really nice here as a 4-mana 3/4 that can be a sacrifice outlet by being able to sacrifice creatures or artifacts to draw you cards, but also to like double the number of tokens you're getting. If you're making a mercenary token, for example, you get to make an extra vampire that has lifelink, which is really nice as upside, or if you're making any other type of token. Ruthless Lawbringer is really nice in this deck as well, because if you have a couple of 1/1 tokens running around, you can sacrifice a 1/1, kill one of your opponent's really strong non-land permanents, usually a big creature, and that's just really nice upside for 3 mana. And then Rictus Robber is fantastic in this deck, because not only is getting a 4/3 plus a 2/2 really good if you like trade in combat, for example, but you're going to be able to set this up potentially where in the mid game, maybe you've plotted this card, you can then sacrifice your own creatures or kill your opposing creatures is another straightforward way to do it. But in a deck that has self-sacrifice, you can trigger Rictus Robber more easily than other decks. Though, of course, you can just do it the old-fashioned way via trading in combat or killing your opposing creature and then casting this from plot or whatever you need to do. But it really fits nicely into this deck and makes you an extra token that you can then sacrifice to other effects if you'd like. Next is Blue-Green. This is a deck that cares about casting big spells and plotting and generally just getting good value. So Doc Orlock, Grizzled Genius, is just a nice defensive stat line. 2-mana 2/3 is just going to hold back a lot of creatures, especially those 1/1 mercenaries that can buff other mercenaries to 2 power. So 3 toughness is a big break point in that way. But it also makes it so that when you're plotting cards from your hand, it's going to cost 2 less, which is a really nice upside because it's going to make sure that even if you're plotting, you can plot maybe multiple spells in a turn and then have a really big follow-up turn the following turn. And then sometimes you'll even gain upside from casting things from graveyard or exile, though that's not going to come up as often. Make Your Own Luck is another really nice value play in this deck. 5 mana, you get to essentially draw 3 cards and then put one of them to be plotted, which is really, really nice. The benefit of that is that even though 5 mana draw 3 kind of puts you behind on tempo, you're then going to be able to maybe recover that by casting a big spell plotted the following turn. You can sometimes even get a mana advantage if you like plot a 6-drop or something like that. And then Slickshot Lockpicker is a really cool card in this deck specifically because you're going to get some self-mill from green maybe. You're going to get some plot synergies like Doc Orlock in blue, and then Slickshot Lockpicker actually plays really well, especially with Doc Orlock, because you're going to be able to flashback a card from your graveyard, which means that you're going to get the 2 mana discount from Doc Orlock. Slickshot Lockpicker also has plot itself, so you're going to be able to plot it for cheaper, and overall just a really nice value card in a deck that's going to probably have some ways to enable the plot and some ways to enable the graveyard synergy. So just a nice card in blue-green. Next is Black-Red, the final archetype we're going to discuss, and this is just a great outlaw aggro deck. Vial Smasher, Gleeful Grenadier tells you pretty much exactly what you want to be doing in this deck. It's 2 mana for a 3/2. When another outlaw comes into play, it deals 1 damage to the opponent. Important to note that that will trigger crimes, which means that if your outlaws care about you committing crimes, then Vial Smasher is going to do great work for you, and also just be a 3/2 creature that deals damage to your opponent in your aggressive deck, which is fantastic. At Knife Point is a really good synergy piece in this deck because whenever you commit a crime, you're going to make another outlaw, which will make it easier to enable attacks in the future because your outlaws can tap to buff creatures' power. It plays great with Vial Smasher because Vial Smasher will commit crimes, as we already discussed. So Vial Smasher in play and at Knife Point in play, whenever you play another outlaw, you essentially get another like 1/1 outlaw because you're going to be able to ping your opponent with Vial Smasher. It's worth noting that at Knife Point will only trigger once per turn, but it's still a really nice way to get a slew of outlaws. And then Hellspur Brute is pretty much the exact sort of card you're looking for in this deck. If you have a lot of outlaws in play, you're going to be able to cast it for cheap. Oftentimes, this is going to be a nice mid-game play where you get to double spell with this. For example, you play like a 4-mana outlaw, and then you have 3 other outlaws in play, and then you play like a Hellspur Brute for 1 mana, or maybe you play a 3-drop and a Hellspur Brute for 2 mana. Just being able to get a huge mana advantage and put a giant creature into play that has trample is going to be something you're looking for in this sort of strategy. So red-black outlaw aggro. Moving on to some combat tricks. These are the ones at common that you should be aware of. In white, there's Take Up a Shield, which gives a +1/+1 counter and lifelink and indestructible. Blue has Take the Fall, as we already discussed, so keep an eye out, especially if your opponent has Outlaws, to make it -4/-0, because that can be a brutal 2-for-1 if your opponent gets you. Skullduggery is also really good against 1 toughness creatures, because you can buff one of your creatures, give one of your opposing creatures -1/-1, maybe even kill it, commit a crime in the process. Skullduggery is fantastic for just 1 mana. Fake Your Own Death, 2 mana, you get to basically make sure your creature comes back into play and you create a treasure token, so that can potentially ramp you going forward. And then Rooftop Assassin isn't technically like a combat trick in the sense that it's an instant, but I wanted to list it here because if your opponent makes a really suspicious attack, then Rooftop Assassin is definitely the sort of card that you should keep in mind, because it's essentially going to give that creature death touch retroactively. So Rooftop Assassin has flash, so it can enable kind of attacking or blocking, so be careful if your opponent is suspiciously holding up a 4 mana. Quick Draw is a really cool one. Gives a creature +1/+1 and first strike, and it's funny because if you play a Quick Draw and then your opponent plays a Quick Draw, then it's almost like they got a quicker draw because they remove your first strike, which is just kind of funny. But Quick Draw, 1 mana, +1/+1, and first strike. And then Outlaw's Fury can buff up a bunch of creatures at once and even get you a card back if you have some Outlaws. So if your opponent makes an attack with a bunch of creatures, keep in mind Outlaw's Fury. Snakeskin Veil can be a way to protect creatures or win combats. So Hexproof is definitely the sort of thing that can really get you, especially if they have a big creature you really want to kill. And then Reach for the Sky is a flash enchantment that can buff a creature, give it reach, so it can definitely do some big combat-y things, and then when it goes to the graveyard, you draw a card. So this one does cost a lot of mana, so make sure that if you are going to go for this, the coast is clear, your opponent doesn't have instant speed removal, potentially, to kill the creature in response to Reach for a Sky, because it has to go from the graveyard to the graveyard from the battlefield for you to draw a card. So if your opponent blows out your creature in response, Reach for the Sky is going to go to your graveyard, and you're not going to get to draw that card, so keep that in mind. Next up are some traps to avoid. First up is Bovine Intervention. It's just not worth it to kill an opposing creature and give them a 2/2, because so many times the 2/2 is going to be a real card that matters on the board state. You're essentially 2-for-1ing yourself, and you don't really want to be doing that. So keep Bovine Intervention in your sideboard. Next is Deep Muck Desperado. 3 mana for a 2/4 is not a terrible stat line, so this is definitely the sort of card that you can put in your deck, but it actually has like some downside, because when you commit a crime, your opponent mills 3 cards, which if you've been looking at some of the synergies in this set that we've been going through, if you look at some of the black cards, like the one that brings back a creature from your graveyard to your hand, then Deep Muck Desperado can actually be some pretty significant downside. You can't actually use this to target yourself. It also doesn't count as committing a second crime, because when you commit a crime, each opponent mills 3 cards, which means you're not targeting them. So Deep Muck Desperado, definitely a card you can play if you need like a defensive blocker or something, but generally if you're trying to do it to like mill out your opponent, that's not really a strategy that's supported in this set. And then finally, Lively Dirge is another card that you can put in your deck, but the text "search your library for a card" oftentimes makes people overvalue how good a card is. And if you spend 5 mana using Double Spree on this card and get to bring back like the best 4-drop from your deck into play, that's oftentimes not going to be worth it unless you have like a really good bomb rare 4-drop. Bringing back 4 mana worth of creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield for 4 mana is generally like not a crazy good play, and just keep that in mind with Lively Dirge. It's like, just because it searches for cards, putting them into your graveyard means that it's not really as effective. Moving on to some combos that you can assemble with commons and uncommons. First up is Sterling Keykeeper and Ariet's Lullaby. This is just a nice little combo you can assemble with only commons in one color, and just kind of a simple combo to start things off, where you can use your Sterling Keykeeper to tap your opponent's non-mount creature for 2 mana, and then use Ariet's Lullaby to kill a tapped creature. So if your opponent is maybe on the defensive and you want to kill a creature that's never getting into combat and attacking with your Ariet's Lullaby, then this is a combo you can look for. Next is Bertram Greywater and Treasure Dredger. As we already discussed with Bertram, he gives you an extra 1/1 whenever you make a token. Now, oftentimes this will be mercenary tokens, but Treasure Dredger lets you just tap, pay 1 life, create a treasure token, and that will trigger your Bertram Greywater. It's also worth noting that the way Baron works is it triggers only once each turn, which includes your turn and your opponent's turn. So say on your turn you play a card that makes a mercenary token, get that extra 1/1. On your opponent's turn, you can use the Treasure Dredger to pay 1 life, make a treasure, and then trigger that Baron as well. So a really nice way to get some extra value over the course of the game, get a bunch of extra 1/1s, and the 1/1s have lifelink, so it offsets the life you're paying from Treasure Dredger to some degree. Next is Raucous Entertainer with Rise of the Varmints. Raucous Entertainer puts a counter on each creature you control that enter the battlefield this turn. Rise of the Varmints has the ability to make many creatures over the course of a turn if you are filling up your graveyard, and so that's just the sort of combo that's going to end the game and be the sort of dream that you can live. And then finally, there is the classic Steal and Sack combo. You play Take for a Ride on your opponent's creature. hit them with it, and then sacrifice it to a sacrifice effect such as Corrupted Conviction, killing your opponent's creature and getting a little bit of free sack fodder in the process. Next up is the mana fixing in this set. First up is colorless and lands. There are 10 lands in this set that are dual lands, essentially. They tap for one of two colors, such as Lonely Arroyo, which can tap for white or blue. They come into the battlefield tapped, and when they enter the battlefield, they deal 1 damage to target opponent, which importantly will trigger cards that care about committing a crime. So keep those in mind, especially take them highly for decks that care about committing crimes, such as your blue-black decks that care about committing crimes, and especially also for your aggressive decks, where the extra points of damage can really add up. Mirage Mesa is another tap land that can be used to fix for any color you'd like. Conduit Pylons comes into play, can maybe even fill your graveyard a little bit, and then is a little bit of a filtering land. These sorts of lands aren't always very useful because filtering is sometimes, especially if you're trying to play just a 2-color deck, you don't really want to be paying an extra mana premium on all of your cards. So Conduit Pylons is more of a niche fixing sort of option. And then at colorless, there's Silver Deputy, which is also a little bit more niche. 2 mana for a 1/2 is a pretty poor stat line. So if you really need fixing or really have desert synergies, you can put Silver Deputy into your deck and put one of your lands on top, but you generally don't want to be paying 2 mana for a 1/2, even if it does have an activated ability. And then Oasis Gardener, a little bit of life gain, a little bit of mana fixing, a little bit of ramp. It is fragile if you're using it for mana fixing because your opponent can just kill it before you can use it to play your splash card or whatever, but as a supplementary source of fixing, it can totally be fine to put in your deck. And then moving on to some green mana fixing at common, there's Hard Bristle Bandit, which can tap for any color, though again, it's pretty fragile as a source of fixing. And then Dance of the Tumbleweeds, you can pay 3 mana to get a basic land and put it onto the battlefield, so a little bit of ramp, a little bit of fixing. And then if you get to the late game, you can even make a big creature token as well. Moving on to some final tips. Have a plan for your plot spells that is resilient to interaction. They are face up after all. This is one that I just wanted to mention because a lot of the time it's easy to think, okay, I'm going to plot this card this turn, and then I'm going to play this creature, and then I'm going to play my plot spell. And the downside is if you're relying on having a creature in play when you cast your plot spell or things like that, your opponent will know that the plot spell is coming. They're going to try to stop you. And so just keep that in mind when you're using your plots, that your plan has some sort of resiliency or you have some sort of backup plan. And also that you don't just like leave your creatures exiled forever, because you do want to affect the board and actually be able to attack and block with your creatures. The next tip is that mercenary tokens shift which stat lines are valuable. So this makes X1 creatures, so like 3/1s, 2/1s, any creatures like that, get worse when a lot of cards come tacked on with an extra 1/1, because trading one of your creatures that you spent mana for a 1/1 is pretty bad in limited. It's just going to make you fall behind, especially if the creature that you played didn't come with some sort of inbuilt advantage like drawing you a card or having some sort of impact on the game. It also makes it, because of their ability to tap and buff creatures, it makes it so that a conventional creature like a 2/3 can't actually hold back an army of 2/2s anymore. So something like a 2/4 is a little bit more valuable in this set, because if you have a bunch of 2/2 creatures, then all of a sudden all those 2/2s can become 3/2s if this mercenary gets used, which means that your 2/3 creature no longer holds them back, no longer protects your life total the way it normally would. And so just keep that in mind, that if you are going to be playing a defensive deck, you're going to want to have creatures with a little bit higher toughness than you're used to. And if you're playing an aggressive deck, you're going to want to be able to race your opponent with creatures that don't have 1 toughness, because you don't want to trade them off for these 1/1s. So just a little stats shift in your mind of what's valuable in terms of stat lines for mana value. And then finally, there are a couple of bonus sheets in this set, and I just wanted to remind everybody that any card you see in a pack is legal to draft. And so you don't have to necessarily think, okay, I'm going to memorize every single card on every single bonus sheet. Just know if you see a card and it looks good for your deck, you can take it, put it in your deck, and play it, no matter what the legality is in other formats. Anyway, that is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe for more, and comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave hashtag #OutlawDrafter in the comments section down below to let me know you made it to the end and enjoyed it. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the plane of Thunder Junction.